If being treated like a ghost has a sound, it was the laughter at that table. I say that now because the first thing people hear in my story must be the bone-deep truth. Family is supposed to be shelter, but mine became the storm. I'm Jesse Hawthorne, 65, a man who learned how fragile dignity can be when people you love decide to measure you by your bank balance instead of your heart. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from and drop your take in the comments as you watch. Share your reaction, opinions, and what you think really happened. I read them all. We'll be giving shoutouts to standout comments and videos in the next upload, so make sure yours counts. I've never been proud of my clothes or my bank balance. I was proud of Anna, my wife of 30 years, and the small business we built together until the collapse that took everything. After her death, the quiet of our house felt heavier, not because it was empty, but because I realized how much I had trusted people who were only passing through my life. For years, I swallowed the slow poison of exclusion and humiliation, convincing myself that love would outlast greed. That illusion died the night my son humiliated me at the family dinner. He said to me, "Dad, don't sit on this table, this is for the rich, not the poor like you." It should have been a private wound. Instead, it became a public spectacle. Lauren laughed. Amy and George laughed. I felt every eye on me. Humiliation is not a moment. It is a ledger you keep in your chest. I felt the old numbness settle in, the kind that follows a funeral and pretends it's resignation. My retirement notice had arrived that week, a $30,000 payout, in installments, meant to keep me afloat. That sum felt like a fragile paper shield against a storm of contempt. The waiter set the bill on the table. $5,630. The number materialized like an accusation. They all turned to me, as if the routine of their cruelty required my compliance. I reached for my wallet with hands that had built and fixed 100 things, the hands that had steadied my daughter as a child. I paid the bill. Quietly. Without protest. The color drained from my face, but my smile was, as always, polite. It was survival masquerading as civility. But the story didn't end there. As I rose to leave, an old, familiar voice cut through the chatter and the clinking of glasses. Sophie Reyes, my mother, whose name meant weight in that room. Where most would expect a matriarch to shuffle away from drama, she walked into the center and said, "May I have a moment, please?" I could hear the disbelief in the air. My family stilled. The entire dining room leaned in, an orchestra of judgment waiting for the conductor's baton. She spoke slowly, each word a deliberate drop of water carving through stone. She told them she had watched their behavior for years. She called the cruelty what it was: betrayal. To be betrayed by blood is a pain that reshapes you. To be betrayed publicly is to be handed your own obituary in front of strangers. But Sophie did something my children had never done. She named the wound. She said she was disappointed, not in a perfunctory way, but with a gravity that made them uncomfortable. That single intervention was a fracture in the narrative they had rehearsed for years, the narrative that had reduced me to a punchline. I felt a strange blend of numbness and relief. The humiliation remained, but Sophie's words cracked the shell that had kept me silent. People often ask whether I wanted revenge right then. The truth is I wanted justice, but more than that I wanted recognition. A simple acknowledgement that exclusion and cruelty had real faces and real consequences. As I walked out into the Tulsa night, the cooling air felt like a passport to something unknown. The laughter followed me, distant and obscene, but so did Sophie's look, steady, almost fierce. That look would become the hinge of everything that followed. I did not know then that her intervention at Meridian Hall was only the beginning of a reckoning that would expose secrets, unravel lies, and eventually demand accountability. Humiliation had been my steady companion for years, but that night I learned that exposure had power. The world, I would later understand, has a hunger for truth when it's given a spectacle. What began as a family's private cruelty was about to become a public narrative, and I, the man they had made invisible, would be the witness and the unexpected beneficiary of a truth too large to be contained by dinner-table jokes. That night, the words legacy and justice pulsed in my head like a stubborn drum. For so long, my life had been catalogued as losses. Business, home, Anna. Sophie's intervention planted a different ledger, one accounting for character, compassion, and resilience. In the silence that followed, I felt the first stirrings of a truly new freedom. Not freedom from pain, but freedom to be heard. It was a dangerous hope, the kind capable of changing the direction of a life. The bill felt like an accusation. $5,630, a number placed on linen as if it were proof of something I had failed to be. I reached for my wallet and paid. The $30,000 retirement payment Anna and I had arranged was supposed to be a guardrail, paid in installments. It felt flimsy against the scale of the evening. Paying the bill was not just about money. It was about refusing to be dramatic, about keeping some dignity intact even when everything else had been eroded. After the meal, I walked to my car beneath the amber lights on the street. The cold had a clarity to it that made me think more honestly than I usually allowed. Sophie had watched the whole thing with a certain stillness. Later, in her parlor over tea, she told me she'd seen enough. "You deserve better than their laughter," she said. I told her about the retirement payout, the mortgage, and the way bills arrived with new signatures on them. I told her the story I had kept to myself. How small favors became patterns, how generosity had been repurposed as entitlement. Sophie's response was practical and precise. She didn't offer catharsis. She offered a plan. "We document," she said. "We don't shout." The words felt like armor. We began gathering bank statements, insurance records, canceled checks, and tuition receipts. Each page uncovered more than numbers. It revealed choices made in my absence. There was a tuition invoice for Weston dated after Anna's funeral. There was a notarized form that did not match my handwriting. There were withdrawals that traced into accounts I had never touched. The shoebox of old envelopes on my shelf became a dossier of hurts. Every discovery was painful and clarifying. The discovery that the life insurance policy Anna left, $750,000, had been diverted was the hardest blow. I had assumed trust. I had assumed that after Anna, what remained was mine to manage. Seeing the trail of transfers and unauthorized signatures changed the humiliation into something else. Outrage. The envelope of family loyalty I had been carrying for decades had been slit open and the contents taken. Sophie hired an attorney to begin discreet inquiries. She insisted on caution. She hated publicity. "If you make noise, they will make noise back," she warned. We moved like people gathering evidence for a careful case. Interviews with a few old friends, a request for records at the insurance company, a quiet audit of certain accounts. There was also treated like a ghost calculation to be made. It was the laughter at that table. Legal action would require money now because the first thing people hear in my story finances be a barrier felt like a kindness. Family is supposed to be shelter, because I had been raised to be proud and self-sufficient. I'm Jesse Hawthorne. The other cost was social. A man who learned how fragile dignity can be when people that I was stirring trouble to measure you by your bank balance instead of your risk. Before we dive in, one way or another, she said, and drop your take in the comments as you watch. Share your reaction, opinions, and what you think really happened. I read them all. I kept a shoebox of receipts by my bedside and added out comments and videos in the next upload. An old tuition notice, an email about a family loan. I've never been proud of my clothes with a signature that looked remarkably like mine, but not exactly. My wife of 30 years. Sophie laying out worst-case scenarios built together until the collapse that took everything. Private investigators death and the quiet of our house felt heavier into scandal. Not because it was empty, used words like because I realized how much I had trusted legal jargon, but as likely reality life. Weston and Lauren might try to paint me unstable of exclusion and humiliation, could stoke narratives to myself that love would outlast greed. We prepared discreetly. That illusion died the night investigator to track account access at the family dinner. Photocopied every insurance policy and endorsement. Don't sit on this table. This is for the rich, Anna's former colleagues like you, our longtime accountant. It should have been a private wound. Numbered documents, it became a public spectacle. Sophie's counsel. Lauren laughed. Nights were hardest. Amy and George laughed. Sat beside me like a second every eye on me. Fear of public spectacle is not a moment being misrepresented. It is a ledger you keep in your chest. A growing resolve. I felt the old numbness settle in. Legacy and compassion that follows a funeral. Insisting money without resignation corrodes meaning. My retirement notice had arrived that week. My shame into $30,000 payout. We were not seeking revenge. Meant to keep me afloat. We were preparing to demand accountability. Felt like a fragile paper shield against a storm of contempt. The waiter set the bill and asked for a moment. The restaurant's hum snapped into attention. The number she did not raise her voice like an accusation. She looked at us with the kind of steadiness that makes small talk feel of their cruelty required my compliance. Made the room feel smaller. I reached for my wallet with hands that had built and fixed their laughter what it was. the hands that dressed as my daughter as a child, and named the quiet patterns I had endured. Quietly, petty mockery, without protest, and the ways children the color drained from my face, but my smile was, as always, polite. The family's choreography was survival masquerading was a civility. Lauren was indignant. The story didn't end there. Amy and George as I rose to leave, looks that promised retaliation. Voice cut through the chatter, and the clinking pulled me aside and said, "Sophie Reyes, my mother, talk," whose name meant in her library, room, a room smelling of old paper and quiet, to shuffle away from drama. Something that explained the urgency behind her words. May I have a moment, given her a prognosis? I could hear the disbelief she said without melodrama. My family still. She spoke as the entire dining room fact to action, an orchestra of judgment waiting accelerated decisions. Sophie had always moved with a strategist's deliberate drop of water carving through small patterns for years. She told them she had watched their behavior for years. Sudden renovations. She called the cruelty what it was. Her intervention at Meridian Hall had not been spontaneous, moralizing. It was to be betrayed publicly in a structure she had been observing in front of strangers. She would not let what she had built something my children had never done. Kindness as a commodity. She named the wound. We began to plan quietly. She was disappointed. Not in a wanted documentation, but with a gravity that made them uncomfortable. She instructed me to collect that single intervention was a fracture in the narrative they had rehearsed for years. Prompted unease. The narrative that had reduced me to a punchline. Who moved like clockmakers. I felt a strange blend of numbness and relief, and a lawyer who understood discretion remained. Nights were long with memory work, the shell that had kept me silent. Piecing together conversations, whether I wanted revenge, small transactions I had once assumed I wanted justice. But more than that, I wanted recognition. The fog, a simple acknowledgement that spoke of legacy and cruelty had reframed money's real consequences. Money without character I walked out into the Tulsa night, she said. The cooling air felt like a passport to something unknown, but for protection. The laughter followed me. Legal aid and counseling for men and fathers who had been dismissed. Steady, the idea changed the tenor of what we were doing. The hinge of everything retaliation. This was correction, then that her intervention at Meridian Hall was only the beginning of a backlash that would expose secrets. They will use gossip as armor, she said, and eventually demand accountability. Copies of original policies had been my steady companion and an evidence trail that would stand up to scrutiny. I learned that exposure had power. Family is hungry for narratives. I would later understand. Rumors travel fast. Hunger for truth when it's given a spectacle. And wanted truth began to be ready. As a family's private cruelty was about to become a public narrative that had begun ticking. The man they had made for a love that would not look away, witness and the cautious ready beneficiary of a truth intervention was not a solution by dinner table jokes. It was a promise. That night, dangerous promise that would demand everything I could give. Pulsed in my head like a stubborn drum. She had redrafted for so long. The dining room my life had been cataloged in a way that made ordinary breaths sound loud. Home. Anna, I am leaving my estate to Jesse, planted a different ledger, flatly and without one accounting for character. The words compassion, quiet, and resilient space. In the silence that followed, I felt the first stirrings of a truly new freedom. Amy clutched her napkin from pain, but freedom to be heard like small witnesses. It was a dangerous sudden rupture, the kind capable of changing the direction of a life. A codicil, the notarized, felt like an accusation. Explained calmly that she had spent years observing patterns that troubled her. On linen, I will not leave my life's work to those who demonstrate entitlement. I reached for my wallet and paid. The reaction was $30,000 retirement payment Anna and I had arranged was supposed to be a guardrail. Influence, diminished capacity, manipulation. It felt flimsy against the scale that I would blow through any fortune. The bill was not just about money, that it was unfair. It was about refusing to be dramatic. Someone accused keeping some dignity intact, even when everything else was then eroded. The accusation revealed the accuser's motives. I walked to my car beneath the amber lights on the street. Legal countermeasures had a clarity to it that made me recent medical affidavits and the necessary legal confirmation. Sophie had watched the whole thing with a certain stillness and had prepared a packet explaining her rationale. She told me she'd seen enough. Threats of litigation arrived better than their laughter, she said. Lawyers were retained. I told her about the retirement payout, were issued, the mortgage, and the family's private argument became new signatures on the battle. I told her the story I had kept to myself, part of the confrontation, how small favors became patterns. How generosity polarized quickly as entitlement. Some called Sophie's response was practical, others praised her courage. My phone was filled with messages. She offered a hostile and supportive. We document. For the first time in years, we don't my shout. Name was a headline. The words felt like armor. That exposure began gathering bank statements, headlines, insurance records, canceled checks, and tuition receipts. Audiences prefer each clean villains. Uncovered more than Sophie's numbers. Decision reframed money choices made in my absence, not entitlement. There was a tuition invoice for Weston's dated after for those who had been rendered invisible. There was a notarized form that did days after the announcement became a choreography of legal steps traced into accounts. Notarizations double-checked. The shoebox of old envelopes on my shelf became a dossier of offenses. Every discovery was hired aggressive teams promising to litigate. The discovery that the life insurance policy analyst surfaced. Sophie's strategy remained to be methodical and dignified. Was the hardest blow. She insisted the estate be used for accountability and compassion. After Anna, not household was mine to manage. I felt many things. The trail of transfers, someone unauthorized signatures changed the humiliation public attention would bring, outrage, and a dawning sense of responsibility. Family loyalty $10 billion I had been carrying for decades had been split open. It wasn't a windfall to spend on whimsy. Sophie hired as a charge to begin resources in ways that repaired harm. She insisted on caution. The revelation made the battle publicity. It also turned private humiliation into a fight for accountability. We moved like people gathering evidence for a careful case. The stage had shifted. Interviews with a few old friends, had witnesses, a request for documents at the insurance company, and the possibility that truth could become the measure that mattered. The folder Sophie left on my kitchen table felt heavy with that consequence. Inside were bank statements, because the first thing people hear in my story must be the notarized authorization bearing a signature that looked like mine, but was slightly off. The storm. As I read, Jesse Hawthorne became 65. Transfers meant for learned how fragile dignity can be when $50,000 decide to measure you by your bank redirected to pay for education, before we dive in, and accounts benefiting watching from, and drop your take on comments as you watch. That discovery was a cold, reaction, raw kind of betrayal. What you think really happened in a forensic accountant. We'll be giving shout-outs to standout comments and videos examine next upload. Handwriting compared, so make sure yours counts. Traced to specific invoices. I've never been proud of my clothes or my does not have feelings. I was proud of Anna, proof. My wife of 30 years, item changed the story from rumor to evidence until the collapse. Sophie's dossier was steady after her death. The quiet of our house felt heavier. Scrutiny, not because it was empty. Their first because I realized how much I had trusted people who were only distracting from my life. Weston and Lauren retained flashy counsel to frame our inquiries as a family dispute, convincing myself that love would outlast greed. And George hired that illusion died and the private investigators humiliated me at the family dinner. It was the same script Sophie had anticipated. On this table. This is for the rich, drown out not the poor like you. But timestamps and bank logs are a private wound. Our files were corroborated and time public spectacle. We presented them methodically. Amy and George interview shifted. I felt every eye on me. Weston, humiliation is not a moment that expenses had been paid from family accounts. Lauren, I felt trying to recover the angle. Described transfers as a funeral and pretend made a resignation remark about my retirement notice had arrived that week. Clip went viral. $30,000 payout, 54 million views in days, meant to keep me afloat. People rewound it. That some felt like a fragile paper shield against a storm of contempt. The footage amplified the documents Sophie had gathered. $5,630 humiliation turned into a materialized documented account of exploitation. They all turned to me. We moved as if the routine of their cruelty required my compliance. Subpoenas prepared. I reached for my wallet with calculations began and fixed 100 the forensic accounting guided the figures. Studied my daughter as a child. Interest. I paid the bill. It was bitter arithmetic, without protest. But it translated betrayal. The color drained from my face, claims. But my smile was, as always, public support coalesced. It was survival rights masquerading as civility, and men who had suffered similar indignities reached out. As I rose to leave, shame became familiar voice cut through the chatter and altered the dynamics. The family's attempts to my mother and whose name meant failed in that evidence held. Where most would expect a matriarch to shuffle away from drama, we had a bank into the center or a notarized page. May I have a moment, please? Redirected the narrative from rumor to accountability in the air. The personal cost remained stilled. Neighbors the entire dining room leaned friends were tested, and orchestra and family ties for waiting for the conductor's baton. But the discovery and publication of the records each word a deliberate drop of water rather than endless quiet suffering. She told them when a reporter asked me what I wanted for years. I said simply, she called I wanted a family what it was, not fortune. Betrayal. Finding that they took what Anna left blood is not about money shapes you. It's about injustice. To be betrayed publicly is to be handed your own obituary story and resonated. But exposure had begun my children had never done, turning humiliation into evidence. Rumor into she was disappointed, and not in a perfunctory way, the possibility of restitution and accountability. After Sophie's intervention was a fracture in the narrative they had rehearsed for years. They retreated from dinner table civility into the old to a familiar strategy of attack. I felt a strange blend of numbness and relief and litigate. The humiliation remained from the edges of my own life as a shell that has kept me silent. A man who had often asked whether I wanted revenge right saying instead the truth is I wanted entitlement exposed. More than that, I wanted recognition hardened like flint. A simple acknowledgement that began to rehearse cruelty had real faces and real consequences. Amy and George arranged as I walked out into the Tulsa night. It felt like being watched by a chorus like prepared to sing something unknown. The laughter followed Sophie of manipulation, but they claimed collusion. Steady, floated the phrase undue influence that look like would become the hinge the language of everything that followed. Cold. I did not know then as a way to reframe cruelty as concern. Only the beginning of a reckoning accusations and felt a familiar sickening wash of humiliation and eventually demand accountability. How quickly humiliation had been my steady companion for years. Ledger of power shifts. But that night I learned that exposure had power. Often requires a story I would later understand. They were busy writing one that made them for truth when it's given a spectacle. They hired lawyers who as a family's private cruelty letters arrived to become a public narrative. Immediate cessation of any defamatory action would be private investigators began to shadow Sophie's truths too large to be contained by dinner table jokes. Amy and George whispered to tabloid contacts, and within days pulsed in my head like a stubborn drum. Rumors are slippery things. My life had been catalogued as momentum. Reports surfaced implying I had squandered any assets I once had, planted a different I was an opportunist, one accounting my mother's courage, compassion, and resilience. My past failures were mined like coal for a public fire. I felt the first stirrings of a truly new freedom, and told me to expect from pain, but freedom to be heard. Cruelty does little to blunt its sting, the kind capable of changing the direction of a life. My isolation deepened like an accusation should have been my defenders chose to manufacture a narrative to protect placed on linen as if it were proof of something I had failed attempting to preserve their standard of living. My wallet and proved how little value they placed on retirement payment. Anna and I had arranged slowly supposed to be a guardrail. Documentation, Sophie had said, it felt flimsy against the scale of the evening. So we documented. The bill was not just Sophie's about money. Attorney Bobby. It was about organized the materials with a calm that about keeping some dignity. Bank statements were copied. Everything else had been eroded. Were compared. After the meal, tuition I walked to my car beneath the amber lights from another life. The cold had a clarity was a map of choices, made me think more honestly than I usually allow. The private investigator had hired trace transfers and connected names to transactions. Later, in her parlor over staking, she told me she'd seen enough. With every discovery better than their laughter, she said. The $750,000 retirement payout the mortgage Anna had intended for me. Bills arrived with new signatures on them. The accounts where money had disappeared. I had kept to myself. But the legal world has its favors became patterns. How generosity had been repurposed as entitled public opinion had already issued verdicts for many and precise. Press outlets ran pieces on both sides. She offered social media ignited into polarized camps. She said. Some branded shout gold digger. The words others felt wrong like man finally seen. We began gathering bank statements, was exhausting. Insurance records. However, the link that hurt most was not the tabloids. Each page uncovered more than numbers. Personal betrayals. It revealed choices made in my absence. Neighbors who pretended there was a tuition invoice for Weston dated after Anna's funeral. Social exile. There was a notarized form that did not match my handwriting. Of kindness began to appear. Withdrawals that traced into accounts sent a letter recounting a time I had helped when it mattered. Envelopes on my shelf became a dossier of hurts. Men who had discovered similar indignities reached out by email. The discovery that the life insurance policy formed a thin bridge back to humanity. $750,000. The public spectacle showed its dual nature. Was the hardest blow. While it exposed my family trust, it also revealed a network of compassion that would later become the foundation of the work Sophie and I envisioned. The trail of transfers they tried to paint Sophie as weak, changed the humiliation into something else. They attacked her credibility. But when the first family loyalty I had been carrying for decades had been slit to her clear-minded contents taken, their narrative Sophie hired an attorney to begin discreet inquiries. It anchored truth in a formal, undeniable way. She hated publicity. When combined with the ledger of transfers, they will make noise found, she warned. The legal challenge began to look less like evidence for a careful case and more like an act of desperation. With a few old friends, I began to speak with elder rights advocates and a small circle of friends who believed me. We organized community letters, contacted journalists who valued nuance, and prepared statements that emphasized justice over vengeance. Each step was measured. If Sophie treated like a ghost with dignity, it was the laughter she reminded me that the aim was accountability now because the first thing people hear in my story must be kept me tethered when the noise threatened to drown the facts and resolve. But mine became as the first full week of Fallout Hawthorne, 65. I stood in Sophie's garden who learned how fragile dignity can be when people you love decide to measure you by your bank balance instead of your heart. There would be more lies. Before we dive in, but the architecture of their entitlement had been taken the comments as you watched. In the rubble there was now a reaction to accountability, and what you think really happened had been a sentence. I read them all. Exposure offered a shout-outs to standout comments and videos in the next upload. Steadily. So make sure yours counts. When a private argument turns public, been proud of my clothes or my bank balance. A blurred phone clip of Sophie's announcements my wife of 30 years, any of us expected. And a small business within hours together until the moment had become a viral moment. After her death, virality the quiet of our house felt heavier, rumor, and spectacle. Not because it was empty, my family's private because I realized how much I had trusted people who were only passing through my life. Tidy villain more than messy truth. I swallowed the slurred poison of exclusion and humiliation by dawn. convincing
Local
myself
anchors
that
wanted
love would
color.
outlast greed.
Cable producers
illusion
wanted
died
conflict.
the night my son
Social media
humiliated
divided
me at
into
the family
camps.
dinner. Some
He said
called
to
me
me,
a gold digger.
"Dad, don't sit
Others
on this
hailed
table.
Sophie's
This is for
courage.
the rich,
Headlines
not the poor like
flattened
you."
nuance into slogans.
It should
and
have been
in
a
that
private
private
wound.
to family story
Instead,
became a
it
battleground,
became a public
People
spectacle.
searched histories
Lauren
and dug
laughed.
up old business failures
Amy
to
and
make
George
a thumbnail
laughed.
narrative. I
An
felt
easy
every
frame.
eye on me.
The poor father who
Humiliation
waited for a
is not a
windfall.
moment. They tried
It
to
is a
make
ledger
me a
you keep in your
caricature.
chest.
Tabloids
I felt the
suggested
old numbness
opportunism,
settle in.
the kind
Anonymous
that follows a
commenters
funeral
invented
and
motives.
pretends its resignation.
Weston and Lauren's
My
PR
retirement
machine
notice had
fed
arrived
talking
that week.
points to
A
sympathetic
$30,000
outlets.
payout
In
and
installments
George whispered
meant
to
keep me
reporters.
afloat.
The
That
smear
some
machine
felt
is
like
like
a
a fragile
fragile
paper shield against a
Plant a
storm
rumor,
of contempt.
nudge a question.
The waiter
Wait for
set
it
the
to
bill
spread.
on the table. It was painful to see my life reframed by
$5,630
people who had never
The
known
number
me outside of
materialized
headline
like
bites.
an accusation.
But not all
They all
coverage
turned
was
to me.
shallow, as if the
A careful
routine of their
reporter
cruelty
asked to see the
required my
records
compliance.
Sophie had assembled.
I reached for
He
my
sat
wallet
in
with
Bobby
Bobby
Sinclair's
Sinclair's
office
office
with
and
stacks
stacked
of
of
bank
bank
statements,
statements, the hands
notarized
that had studied
pages,
my daughter
and
as a
witness notes.
child. His
I
piece
paid the
focused
bill.
on evidence, quietly, dates,
without
transfers,
protest.
and signatures.
The color drained
It
from
did
my
not
face,
seek
but
to
my
dramatize.
smile was, as
It
always,
aimed
polite.
to clarify.
It was
That
survival
article shifted some
masquerading as
narratives
civility
away from spectacle
but the
and
story
toward
didn't
facts.
end there.
And those facts
As I rose
mattered
to
when
leave,
legal
an
minds
old
started to
familiar
pay attention.
voice cut through the
Meanwhile,
chatter and the clinking of
family
glasses.
continued a counteroffensive.
Sophie Reyes, my
They
mother,
retained
whose
aggressive
name meant
counsel
weight in that room,
and hired private
most would
investigators
expect
to
a matriarch
monitor
to
witnesses.
shuffle away from drama.
Weston and
She
Lauren
walked into the
appeared
center
on morning
and said,
shows with polished
"May I
indignation,
have a moment, please?"
trying to recast the
I could
story
hear
with
the
tears and
disbelief
rehearsed
in the
regret.
air.
In
My
one
family
interview, Lauren
stilled.
made a careless
The entire
remark about
dining room
family
leaned in.
accounts, an
And
orchestra
that slip
of
spread
judgment
online
waiting for the
like
conductor's
kerosene.
baton. Small
She spoke
admissions
slowly,
become fuel in
each
a
word
media
a deliberate
environment
drop of
hungry
water
for
carving
confirmation
through stone.
of wrongdoing. She told
The
them
viral
she had
clip
watched
of a
their
heated
behavior for
confrontation,
years, where
she
Lauren
called
muttered
the
something
cruelty
about
what it
helping
was.
ourselves.
Betrayal
became a
To be
turning
betrayed
point.
by blood
It was
is a
raw
pain
and
that
unguarded.
reshapes you.
Millions
To be betrayed
watched,
publicly
replayed,
is to be
and
handed
shared.
your own obituary
The clip gave
in front of
context
strangers.
to the documents
But
Sophie
Sophie
had
did
gathered.
something my children
For a
had never
moment,
done.
the court of public
She
opinion
named the
tilted
wound.
toward scrutiny of
She
the
said
family's
she was
conduct,
disappointed,
and that
not
public
in a
attention
perfunctory
provided
way,
breathing room
but
for
with
the
a
legal
gravity
strategy
that made them
Sophie had
uncomfortable.
insisted on. That single
Quiet
intervention
accumulation
was a
of
fracture
evidence
in the
and careful
narrative they had
presentation.
rehearsed for years.
Public support
the narrative
swelled
that had
in
reduced me to a
unexpected
punchline.
ways.
I
Men
felt
who
a
had been
strange
humiliated
blend of
by
numbness and
relatives
reached
reached
out with messages of
humiliation
sympathy
remained,
and solidarity.
but Sophie's words
Neighbors
cracked
and
the shell
former
that had kept
clients
me
sent
silent.
letters recalling my
People
past
often
kindnesses
asked whether
and
I
decency.
wanted revenge
An
right then.
elder rights group
The truth
offered
is
to
I wanted
connect us with
justice,
advocates.
but more than that, I
These
wanted
responses
recognition.
reminded me that
A simple
exposure can also
acknowledgement that
produce
exclusion
compassion
and cruelty
that the
had
same
real
platform
faces
used
and
to
real
shame can be
consequences.
used to rally
As I
support for
walked out
justice.
into the Tulsa night,
the family
the
intensified
cooling
their
air
tactics,
felt like a passport to
hired
something
smear
unknown.
consultants.
The
Leaked
laughter
selective
followed
documents,
distant
and
and
encouraged
obscene,
defamation
but so
through
did
friendly
Sophie's
columnists.
look. Steady,
Harassment
almost
of witnesses
fierce.
began.
That look
Subtle
would become
threats,
the hinge
anonymous
of
calls,
everything that
and
followed.
attempts to intimidate
I did
those
not
who
know
would
then
corroborate
that her
Sophie's
intervention
timeline.
at Meridian Hall
Those
was only
actions
the beginning
only
of a reckoning
underscored
that
their
would expose
desperation.
secrets.
For many
unravel
observers,
lies,
the
and
pattern of
eventually
behavior
demand
spoke as
accountability.
loudly as any
Humiliation
document.
had been my
That
steady
pattern
companion
became
for years.
part of the narrative
But
of
that night
entitlement.
I learned that
and it helped
exposure
the
had
public
power.
and legal teams
The
see
world
the bigger
I would
picture.
later understand.
The intensity
Has a
at
hunger
home
for
grew.
truth when it's given
Sophie's
a spectacle.
health was vulnerable.
What
and the
began as a
circus
family's
threatened to
private
hollow her
cruelty was
final
about
months.
to become a public
We limited
narrative.
interviews
and
and
I,
centered
the
dignity.
man they had made invisible,
The foundation
would
plans
be the
continued
witness
behind
behind
closed
unexpected
doors.
beneficiary of a
Attorneys
truth too
filed
large to be
preemptive
contained by
affidavits
dinner
and
table
accountants
jokes.
prepared
That
audits.
night,
The
by the
words
time
legacy
state-level
and
outlets
justice
joined coverage,
pulsed in my
the
head
narrative
like a
is
stubborn
splintered
drum.
into sensational
For so
headlines,
long, my life had been
investigative
cataloged
reporting,
as losses,
viral indignation,
business,
and local sympathy.
home, Anna.
Each thread
Sophie's
changing how the
intervention
story
planted
would be
a different
weighed.
ledger.
It demanded
One
patience,
accounting for character,
daily resilience,
compassion,
and
and
unwavering
resilience.
integrity. In the silence
In the
that
end,
followed,
the
I
media
felt the
storm
first
was both
stirrings of a
furnace and
truly new
lens.
freedom. It burned
Not
away some
freedom from
illusions
pain,
and
but
exposed
freedom
raw
to be
material.
heard.
It was
also
a dangerous
focused hope,
attention on
the
injustice,
kind capable
the
of
lesson I
changing the
carried
direction
forward
of a
was
life.
unsentimental.
The bill still felt like an
Publicity is
accusation.
dangerous,
But it can be useful.
$5,630.
If wielded with care,
a number placed on
exposure
linen
can
as if it
transform
were proof of
humiliation
something
into
I had failed to
accountability
be.
and gossip
I
into the
reached for my
scaffolding for
wallet
truth.
and paid.
If lies
The
had a heartbeat,
$30,000
I could hear
retirement
them
payment
pulsing
Anna
through the
and
phone
I had
lines
arranged
and into
was
my
supposed
mailbox.
to be a guardrail.
The moment
Paid
Sophie
in
declared her
installments.
intentions,
It
the
felt
course of
flimsy
denial and
against the
deflection
scale
began.
of the evening.
Not with
Paying
sober
the bill
questions,
was not just
but
about
with
money.
strategic whispers
It was
and
about
planted
refusing
stories
to be
designed to
dramatic,
make me the villain.
about keeping some
I am
dignity
Jesse
intact,
Hawthorne,
even when
and I have
everything
learned
else
that
had
when
been
people
eroded.
fear accountability,
After the
they
meal,
weaponize
I
rumors.
walked to my car
turning
beneath
truth
the amber
into
lights
noise
on the
until
street.
no one can hear the
cold
facts.
had a clarity to
They
it
hired
that
a
made
public
me think
relations
more
firm
honestly
large
than
enough
I
to buy
usually
attention,
allowed.
and private
Sophie had
investigators
watched
patient
the whole
enough to
thing
find
with a
things that
certain
could be bent
stillness.
into allegations.
Later,
in her parlor
Amy
over
and George,
tea, she
once
told me
polite at
she'd
holiday
seen
dinners,
enough. suddenly
deserve
became
better than their
emissaries of a
laughter,
narrative
she
that
said.
painted me as an
I told her
irresponsible
about the
spender
retirement
who had
payout,
gambled away
the
a
mortgage,
fortune, and the way
Weston
bills
and
arrived
Lauren
with
fed
new
a steady
signatures
stream
on
of
them.
insinuations
I told
to
her the
local
story I
tabloids,
had kept to myself,
manipulative
how
headlines
small
and
favors
anonymous
became
sources
patterns,
suggesting my
how
failures were
generosity
not
had
just
been
financial
repurposed
but
as
moral.
entitlement. The aim was
Sophie's
not to
response
persuade
was
through
practical
logic, but
and
to drown the
precise.
truth in a
She
swamp
didn't
of
offer
suspicion.
catharsis.
The techniques
She offered
were ugly
ugly
and precise.
We document,
Private
she said.
investigators dug
We
through
don't
50
shout.
years of my life. The words
Pulling
felt
up
like
past
armor.
business failures
We
and
began
magnifying
gathering
them
bank
into
statements,
character flaws.
insurance records,
Old friends
canceled
received
checks,
calls with
and
carefully
tuition
threaded
receipts.
questions.
Each page
Designed to
uncovered
elicit
more
an
than
account
numbers
that could be spun.
It revealed
Anonymous
choices
notes
made in my
appeared in
absence.
Sophie's staff
There was a
inbox.
tuition invoice
Thinly
for
veiled
Weston
hints
dated
about my
after
past
Anna's
that
funeral.
suggested I had been
There was a
opportunistic.
notarized form that
Conversations
did not
I
match
had
my
with
handwriting.
neighbors were recast
There were
as proof of
withdrawals that
instability.
traced into accounts
It was
I had never
harassment
touched.
designed to feel
The
like
shoebox of old
inevitability.
envelopes on my
Worst
shelf
of all
became
were
a
the
dossier
forged
of hers.
insinuations about
Every
Anna's
discovery
death.
was painful
I remember
and
the first
clarifying.
time a reporter
The discovery
asked
that
if
there
there
had
had
ever
ever
been
been
suspicion
suspicion
around her
her
passing.
$750,000
was soft and poisonous.
had been diverted.
The
was the
rumor
hardest
suggested
blow.
I had been imprudent.
I had assumed
That
trust.
grief had been a
I had
cover for
assumed that
malfeasance.
after Anna,
It
what
stung
remained
because
was
Anna's
Anna's
memory
memory
is a lighthouse
Seeing
for me.
the trail of transfers
turned
and
into fodder for
unauthorized
gossip
signatures
felt like
changed the
sacrilege.
humiliation into
The more they
something else.
pushed, the more I
Outrage.
withdrew into
The
a
envelope
silence
of
that
family
felt like
loyalty
preservation.
I had been carrying for
I
decades
refused to
had been
engage
slit
with
open,
salaciousness
and the contents
that traded
taken.
on loss.
Sophie hired an
Sophie
attorney
always
to begin
strategic
discreet
anticipated
inquiries.
this playbook.
She insisted on
She had
caution
warned me that
she
defamation
hated
would
publicity.
escalate.
If you
Her
make
counsel
noise,
and the
they
attorney
will
we
make noise
engaged
back,
prepared
she
us for
warned.
character
We
attacks.
moved like people
We
gathering
documented
evidence for a
everything,
careful case.
added layers of corroboration
Interviews with
to
a
our
few old
evidence
friends,
stack,
a
and
request
worked
for records
quietly
at the
to limit
insurance
the harm.
company, a quiet audit of certain accounts.
We
If
filed
being treated
cease
like
and
a
desist
ghost
letters
letter
and kept a
it was
legal
the
ledger
ledger
of
of
every
every
false
claim. I say
Every
that now
anonymous
because the
tip
first
that
thing
seemed
people hear in my
orchestrated.
story must be
It
the
felt
bone
like
deep
standing
truth.
behind a
Family
sandbag
is
wall.
supposed to be shelter.
The PR
but mine
campaign
became
tried to
storm.
reroute sympathy
I'm Jesse
away from the
Hawthorne,
facts
65,
and toward emotional
a man who
narratives
learned how
crafted to
fragile
make the
dignity
public
can
doubt
be
my
when
motives.
people you love
They
decide to
edited
measure
footage,
you by your bank
leaked
balance
selective
instead of
lines
your
from
heart.
private conversations,
Before we dive in,
and crafted
tell me where you're
op-eds
watching
under
from
pseudonyms.
and drop your take
They
in the
funded
comments as you
sympathetic
watch.
influencers to
Share
pose
your
questions on
reaction,
talk shows about the
opinions, and what you
morality
think
of
really
trusting
happened.
a poor father
I read
with
them
a
all.
billionaire's fortune.
We'll be giving shout-outs
I
to
watched
standout comments and
disoriented
videos in the
as the
next
story
upload.
metamorphosed
So make
into
sure
something
yours
I no
counts.
longer recognized.
I've never been proud
Their
of my
smear
clothes
campaign
or my
achieved
bank
a toxic
balance.
sort of
I was
visibility.
proud of Anna,
People now
my wife
discuss
of
me
30
not as a
years,
person wronged,
and the small
but as a
business we
character
built
in a
together
morality
until
play
the
where I
collapse
wore
that
the
took
mask of
everything.
either villain or
After her
gullible
death,
old man.
the quiet of our
That
house felt
binary
heavier.
suited them,
not because it
the
was
nuance
empty,
of forged
but
signatures
because I
and bank
realized how
transfers
much I
is
had
harder
trusted
to condense
people
into
who were
headlines than a
passing through
simple
my
arc
life.
of successful
4
family
years,
punished,
I swallowed
or
the slow
old man
poison of
rewarded.
exclusion and humiliation.
Sensationalism loves
Convincing
flat
myself
stories.
that love would outlast
Justice
greed.
requires nuance
That
and
illusion
patience.
died the night
We
my
did
son
not fight the
humiliated
noise
me
with
at
more
the family
noise.
dinner.
Sophie
He said
insisted
to me,
on deliberate,
"Dad, don't sit on this table.
document-driven
This is for the
responses.
rich, not the
For
poor
every
like
whisper
you."
they seeded,
It should
produced
have
bank
been a private
timestamps,
wound.
witness affidavits,
Instead, it
and
became
notarized
a public
copies of
spectacle.
records.
Lauren
We sought
laughed.
to make the trail of
Amy
theft and
George
manipulation
laughed.
so obvious
I felt
that it would
every
survive
eye on me.
even the loudest
Humiliation
smear.
is
We
not a
also
moment.
cultivated allies.
It is a ledger you
Former
keep
colleagues
in
of
your chest.
Anna,
I
accountants
felt
who
the
could
old
explain
numbness
transfers,
settle in, and a
the
few
kind that
journalists
follows
with
a funeral
reputations
and
for
pretends
careful
it's
reporting
resignation.
rather than sensational
My retirement
clicks.
notice had arrived
One
that
afternoon,
week.
an
An envelope
$30,000
arrived with a
payout
printout
in
of
installments
installments
between
meant to
me
keep
and
me
an
afloat.
old business partner.
That some felt
Edited
like a
with
fragile
malicious
paper
intent.
shield against
The
a storm
intent
of
was to
contempt.
make me appear
The waiter
disoriented
set the
and
bill on the
unreliable.
table.
It would have been easy to explode
$5,630
with rage.
The number
Instead,
materialized
I reread
like
the
an
raw logs with the
accusation.
attorney and
They all
prepared
turned
the
to me
original
as if
unedited
the
files
routine
for
of their
any
cruelty
court scrutiny.
required my compliance.
This was not only a legal
reached for
fight.
my wallet with
It was a
hands
battle
that had
for
built
narrative
and fixed
control.
100 things.
The harassment
The hands
took
that had
emotional
steadied my
tolls
daughter
too.
as a child.
I received
I
anonymous
paid the bill.
voicemails at night,
Quietly,
alerts from strangers
without
who claimed
protest.
to know the truth. The color drained
And
from my face,
passive-aggressive
but my
comments from
smile
former
was,
neighbors.
as always, polite.
Friends I had known
It was
for decades
survival
became
masquerading
quieter.
as civility.
Their calls shorter.
But
the story didn't end there. As fatigue
As I
set
rose
in
to leave, an
yet through
old
the
familiar
exhaustion,
voice cut
Sophie's
through the
voice
chatter
persisted
and the
as a
clinking of
kind of
glasses.
steady rhythm. Sophie Reyes,
Document,
my mother,
verify,
whose name meant
preserve
waiting that
dignity.
room. That
Where
was
most
the
would
compass
expect
we
a
used
matriarch
to
to
navigate
shuffle
a
away from
campaign
drama
meant to
she
destroy
walked into the
reputations.
center
And said, I did something
May I
I
have
had
a moment,
avoided for
please?
years. I could
I
hear
wrote,
the disbelief
not
in the air.
apologies,
My
not
family
confessions.
stilled. The
I wrote
entire
the
dining
facts as I
room
knew
leaned
them,
in, carefully
an
dated
orchestra
each
of memory,
judgment waiting
and
for the
placed hard
conductor's baton
documents next to
She
soft
spoke
recollections.
slowly, It was a reclamation of my own carving through stone. In the weeks that followed, told them she had watched their behavior for years until one small mistake by my adversaries would change everything. Betrayal. They underestimated a simple human tendency that reshapes you. People with secrets often publicly when they are angry. Handed your own obituary in front of strangers. Sophie's insistence on dignity and documentation my children had never done. We methodically produced the bank timestamps. She said she was disappointed. Notarized records in a perfunctory way, ledgers, but with a gravity that made them uncomfortable. Forming a resilient intervention was a fracture in the narrative they had rehearsed for years, drown evidence and gossip, that had reduced me to a punchline. Manufactured emotion. I felt a strange blend of numbness and relief. We held firm together. The humiliation remained. I still remember the sound of Weston's voice cutting through the room that me silent. A raw edge of entitlement whether I wanted revenge right then. Sophie had arranged a small press gathering at her estate I wanted to clarify the will and to explain her reasons that exclusion and cruelty had real tabloids wanted to make consequences. It was meant to be a controlled conversation with witnesses, and prepared felt like a passport to something unexpected. Was how fury laughter followed tongues, and how a single unscripted moment can Sophie's years of rehearsed deceit, almost fierce. We had planned the event as a measured rebuttal to the smear campaigns. Everything that followed. Medical affidavits. I did not know then that her intervention at Meridian Hall was only the beginning of record showed would expose insurance funds had gone, unravel lies, cameras were and eventually arranged at a small room of reporters. Humiliation had been my steady companion for years. Taught, but that night I learned that Weston and Lauren stormed in. The world, Amy and George, I would later understand, faces flushed, has a hunger for accusation when it's given a spectacle. They did not ask to be heard. What began as a family's private cruelty was about to become a public narrative. Pivoted, and I, some guests, the man they had made uncomfortably, would be the witness and the collapsed under beneficiary of a truth too large to be contained by their loyalty jokes. What they did not know was that they were already being recorded by an independent my head like a stubborn drum. A small civic station that had been following the story cataloged as losses. Within seconds, business, Weston, furious and unchecked, Sophie's intervention planted a different ledger in a voice that cracked between rage and desperation and resilience. In that same burst, blurted a phrase that would change everything. Stirrings of a truly new freedom because we had to, not freedom from pain, but freedom to be heard. The words dropped like pebbles into a still pond, the kind capable of changing the direction of a life. The clip circulated first among local feeds, then $5,630. The phrase we signed for it placed on was replayed as if it were proof of something and placed beside bank records that showed transfers to tuition accounts and renovation. The $30,000 retirement payment that corroborated the forensic trail supposed to be a guardrail had been assembling in installments. For the first time, it felt flimsy against the scale of the evening. Their own the bill was not just about money. Tissue between it was accusation and documented fact. About keeping the aftermath was immediate, even when everything else had been eroded. Exploded. After the meal, I walked to my car outrage and amber lights on the street. On daytime news, had a clarity to it that made me think more honestly than I usually allowed. Widening the lens, Sophie had watched the whole thing with a certain stillness. For those who had already suspected a story of exploitation, the footage felt like confirmation. You deserve better than their uncomfortable questions. I told her about the retirement payout, the mortgage, the family had tried to make me the target with pity signatures on them. They became the story I had kept to myself. Weston and Lauren's PR patterns scrambled to reframe the statement had been repurposed as entitlement. Arguing that under pressure was practical and they don't nice. But she didn't offer the public mind as a moment of unguarded truth. We document the live stream's timestamp. The room's rolling camera footage, the words corroborating like witness accounts formed a composite gathering bank to erase. Insurance overnight, their carefully curated image began to peel away. Each page unpatterned more than entitlement and manipulation many had choices made in my absence. There was a tuition invoice for Weston dated after Anna's funeral. Quickly issued requests for subpoenas that did not match my handwritings. There were withdrawals that traced into accounts I had never touched. Now an active force in the case. Of old envelopes on my shelf became a dossier of hers. Not just in the court of law, was painful and clarifying. The discovery that the life insurance policy admission, $750,000 more than abstract had been diverted was the hardest blow to behavior. I had assumed trust to real consequences. I had assumed that after Anna, the fallout what from a distance was mine to manage. Not in triumph, but with a trail of transfers and unauthorized signatures, recognition, the humiliation into something else. Watching Weston and Lauren unravel in real family loyalty, like satisfaction for decades, more like a strange affirmation, and the contents taken. Truth has a stubborn way of hired an attorney to begin discreet inquiries. The clip did not remove the pain of betrayal. She hated it immediately restored if you make noise, exclusion they will make noise back, she warned. We moved like people gathering evidence for a careful case. Interviews with a few old friends, a request for records at the insurance company, a quiet audit of certain accounts. But it being treated like a ghost as a sound, it made accountability possible in ways that I say that now because the first thing people hear in the live stream must be the offers to speak poured in. Family is supposed to be shelter, sympathetic mine became the storm. And requests for interviews. I'm Jesse Hawthorne, 65, most. A man who learned how fragile dignity can be when people you love decide to measure you by your bank balance rather than head of your heart. Her restraint was strategic. Tell me where you're watching from evidence and drop your take on her comments as you watch. Still, share your viral exposure marked a turning point. What you think really happened. The smear campaign's momentum faltered. We'll be giving shout-outs to stand-out comments and videos in the next upload. The ledger of transfers and the voices admitting to them began to dominate the conversation. Bank balance. Days later, I was an investigative reporter called with a question that felt and the small business like a summons together until the collapse that took everything. Tell your whole story after her death. The quiet of our house felt heavier. I am not ready to tell the truth, but because I realized how much I had trusted people who were files had the number my life. With those pieces aligned, I swallowed the slow poison of exclusion and humiliation, felt less like myself that love more like a last inevitability. That illusion died the night my son humiliated me at the family dinner, accounting alike. He said to me, "Truth. Dad, don't sit on this table. Different this is for the rich, not one the poor that demanded facts rather than fury. It should have been a private Pedro's presence commanded a room became a public spectacle. And I learned quickly that law moves in patient increments rather than dramatic beats. I felt every eye on me. Humiliation is not a codicils. It is a ledger you keep in your chest. And the viral clip that captured Weston and numbness settle in. This was not a trial about sentiment and pretends it's resignation. Accounting for years of betrayal notice had arrived family obligations. A $30,000 payout. The family's attorney meant to keep me afloat. Strategy with vigor. That some felt like a fragile paper shield against the storm of contempt. The waiter set the bill on the table. Undue influence. $5,630. He attempted to thread a narrative suggesting like an or my counsel had coaxed her into decisions. As if the routine of their strategy required my compliance. Attack the source. I reached for my wallet with hands that had built and fixed Sophie's medical records. The hands that had studied my daughter as a child. And her lucid recorded statements created a protective perimeter around her decision. Bobby Sinclair laid out a chronology of meetings and legal steps that made the accusation of survival masquerading as civility. The forensic accounting was not glitzy. As I rose to leave, arithmetic and familiar voice cut through the chatter and the clinking of glasses. Tuition payments. Sophie Reyes, my mother, whose name meant weight in signature. Where most would expect the matriarch to shuffle away from drama, cross-reference them went into the center and school ledgers for Weston's and Lauren's education. Renovations to a property associated with Amy Air, and credit lines used for personal purchases. The entire dining room followed without theatrics, an orchestra of judgment waiting questions that required precise answers. She spoke slowly. Each ledger entry was a deliberate drop of water carving through stone. Each invoice narrowed the space for plausible deniability. Behavior for years. Then came the witnesses. Called the cruelty what it was. There were neighbors who testified about conversations. To be betrayed by blood is a pain that reshapes policy. To be betrayed from the insurance firm to be handed your own obituary in front of strangers. The investigator we hired explained something my children had never done. Digital file. She named ensuring the video and timestamps were disappointed, and there was me taking the stand to tell the human story behind them uncomfortable. The exclusion, the humiliation was a fracture in the narrative they had rehearsed for years. Quietly, the narrative had reduced me to a punchline. I told the judge about evenings I felt a strange blend of numbness humiliation would be the last. The humiliation and how I had always hoped, but for Sophie's words cracked the shell that had kept me silent. Rob Easton tried to dress whether I wanted revenge right then, suggesting my recollections were motivated by the potential I wanted recognition. It was insulting, a simple acknowledgement that exclusion and cruelty had real faces and real consequences. Shift motive, as I walked out into the Tulsa night, will tip away. The cooling air felt like a passport to something unknown. The laughter offered accusation and obscene, presented but so did Sophie's look, where they offered almost fierce. We offered that corroboration. Become the hinge. The trial became a conversation between evidence and accusation. That her intervention at Meridian Hall was to weigh verifying of a reckoning with the exposed secrets. Cross-examinations were sharp. Eventually demand Weston's accountability. Charm attempted to sway with practiced had been my steady companion Lauren's for years. Tears felt staged. But that night I learned that exposure had power. Cracked under scrutiny. The world I would later understand tried to cast doubt on hunger for truth suggesting given a spectacle. But documents are not as a family's private cruelty was about to become a public narrative. The viral clip, played in court at the request of our counsel, would be the witness and the unexpected beneficiary of Weston's admission to be contained by dinner table jokes. Cut through the rhetorical fog, the words legacy, the plainness of what had been said, pulsed in my head like a stubborn drum. Rob pivoted to legal technicalities. My life had been arguing that even if some transfers occurred, business, they were gifts or family loans, not Sophie's intervention. The judge planted a different ledger. Who initiated the transfers, compassion, and resilient documentation in the silence that followed. I felt the evidence stirrings of a truly new freedom. The judge, a man with years of bench experience, but freedom to be pressed on discrepancies. It was a dangerous hope, clear accounting, the kind capable of less changing the direction of a life. Slow accumulation of certainty, like an accusation. Each cross-reference 5,000 space where narrative could hide behind sentiment placed on linen, when the ruling came of something I had failed to be. Drama, but the quiet click for my wallet and completing its work. The $30,000 retirement payment Anna and I had arranged. Sophie was supposed to be a guardrail. He found the signatures in installments. And the viral admission compelling enough to reject the claims of undue influence. Paying the bill was not just about Weston and Lauren. It was about refusing to be dramatic, about keeping some dignity intact, calculated when everything else had been eroded. Interest. After the meal, there were also recommendations for criminal review, amber lights on the street. And the family's legal posture had a clarity to it that made me think more honestly than I usually allowed. Relief that was complicated. Sophie had watched the whole thing felt like a ledger balanced. Later, in her parlor over tea, had affirmed what Sophie and I had claimed. You deserve better than their consequences, she said. Still, I told her about the retirement did not erase years of exclusion and the way bills arrived with new signatures on them. I told her the story as we left the courthouse. Cameras crowded for favors became patterns. Sophie and I retreated to a small room where she took my hand and said, Sophie's response was practical and precise, held more weight than headlines. Catharsis. After the ruling, offered a plan. The press wanted spectacle. We document, but Sophie and I retreated to plan the foundation. The words felt with memories of Anna and the quiet labor of rebuilding trust. Insurance. The judge's words restored a ledger and tuition receipts, not the years lost. Each page uncovered more than restitution and referrals signaled accountability in my absence. Outside the courthouse, there was a tuition invoice for Weston standing after Anna's funeral. Had endured similar. There was a notarized form that did not match my handwriting. Sophie and I had fought. Withdrawals that traced your father's might not be never touched. We began. A shoebox of old envelopes on my shelf down became what he has left after being excluded. Every discovery was painful and clarifying. I started with that when the judge called my policy Anna left. I am Jesse Hawthorne. $750,000 I avoided theatrics. Had been diverted was the hardest plainness. I had assumed trust. I carried years of humiliation after exclusion. What remained was mine to petty cruelties. Seeing the trail of transfers was not revenge. Unauthorized signatures. It was about accountability and dignity. Into something else. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and family loyalty I had been carrying for decades had been listened with a steady gaze taken. Across, Sophie hired an attorney to begin discreet inquiries and implied my motives were monetary. Caution. His tactic was publicity. Reduce memory to greed, they will make noise back, she warned. Bobby Sinclair advised people gathering evidence for a careful case. We presented documents that translated memory into evidence, a request for records at the insurance company, notarized forms, a quiet audit of certain accounts, and witness affidavits. We used documents as proof. I began treated like a ghost as a sound. It was the laughter at that table, the modest business we built. I say that now because the first thing people hear in my story must be the corrosion of respect. Family described Meridian Hall, but mine became Weston's voice cutting like glass. I'm Jesse Hawthorne, $5,630 bill learned how fragile dignity can be when people you love decide to measure you by your bank balance instead of your $750,000 insurance payout. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from and drop your take in the comments as you watch. That followed. Share your reaction. Accountant explained what chain of transfers plainly. I read them all. Funds labeled for me had been shout-outs to stand to my children videos in the next upload. Notarized forms bore signatures that did not match been proud of my clothes or my bank renovation receipts. I was proud of entries my wife of 30 years policy to benefits for Weston and together until the documents felt clinical. After her death, memory, the quiet of our house felt heavier. Rob's cross, not because it was empty, motive, but because I realized how much I had trusted your testimony benefits from the prospect of a $10 billion estate. I swallowed the slow poison of exclusion and humiliation. I seek accountability that love would outlast greed. His line was an attempt to turn sympathy into suspicion. Me at the family dinner. I answered with humility. He said to me, "The facts that underpinned our case. Sit on this table. Not this is for the rich, not the poor like you." Watching Weston and Lauren should have been a private dissonant. Instead, confidence gave way as documents were shown. Lauren laughed. Weston faltered when faced with his recorded statements. I felt every eye unraveled when invoices tied her to transfers. Is not a moment. Their counsel tried to discredit witnesses. Keep in your chest, but paperwork resisted numbness settle in. The kind that follows a funeral and pretends its resignation. The viral clip, my retiring notice had arrived paired with ledgers to form a $30,000 payout. In installments, the viral clip was played in court was quieting. Some felt like a fragile that had been waiting for against a storm of contempt as Weston and Lawrence the bill on the table echoed in a room that prefers facts to fury. I watched his faces changed like an accusation. They all turned to me as if the routine of their cruelty required my compliance. Argument that words alone could not. I reached for my wallet with hands that had built and transactions, and here was the unguarded voice admitting my daughter as a child. It mattered that the admission came from those who benefited. Without between ledger entries, I told the color drained from my face, but my smile was, as always, neighbors averting glances. It was survival masquerading to purchases I never authorized. But the story didn't end there. Each anecdote as I rose to leave, a receipt beside a memory voice cut through the chatter beside a recollection of glasses, and together they built a coherent account, whose name matching memory to record made the narrative hard to dismiss as shuffle away from drama. There were raw moments. The center and said, "I remembered Anna's laugh and the pain of discovering her generosity repurposed. The disbelief in the air about being reframed my family as a villain by those who the entire dining room leaned in, but I kept testimony of judgment waiting for the conductor's precision. She spoke slowly without documentation, each word a deliberate drop of water carving through stone. So I paired feeling with them. She had watched their behavior for accountability. She called Pedro's cruelty what it was. Betrayal. How were transfers initiated by blood is authorized that reshapes which accounts received funds. To be betrayed publicly is to be handed your own obituary in front of strangers. An accountant confirmed she did something my children had never done. An insurance clerk verified endorsement trails. She said she was disappointed about conversations where tuition was attributed to gravity that made them uncomfortable. Each corroboration intervention was a fracture in the narrative they had rehearsed for years. When Rob implied narrative that had reduced me to a punchline through the courtroom, I felt a strange blend of numbness and my life had been catalogued. The humiliation remained. Business, Sophie's words cracked the shell that had kept me silent. I did not come here for fortune. Whether I wanted revenge right then. I came for a ledger to be set I wanted straight. Justice. Saying it aloud, I wanted something inward. A simple acknowledgement that was now public and accountable. Had real faces and real consequences. I felt unexpected. As I walked out into the Tulsa night, testifying had not erased the past, like a passport to something unknown. But it made the laughter followed me, public ledger. Distant and obscene. People approached me afterwards with stories of older fathers pushed aside. Their faces reminded me why I had endured everything that followed. This was about restitution, that her intervention narrative about family obligation, the beginning of a reckoning that would expose Sophie and Anna, unravel lies, one who nurtured and quietly demand accountability, strategized humiliation had been my steady companion for years. But Sophie's that night I learned that documentation and dignity the world the testimony. I would later understand. Anna's memory reminded me that justice has given us as well as legal dimensions. What began as a family's private cruelty was about to become a public narrative. Truth, and given a chance to breathe with evidence, invisible, reshaped rooms where silence the unexpected beneficiary of a arrived like a slowly turning key by dinner table jokes. Not explosive, but final. The words legacy voice filled the courtroom with the kind of authority that makes legal conclusions feel like gravity. My life had been catalogued as the contest and upheld Sophie's will. Home. It did not erase years of humiliation, planted a different ledger back toward justice. Accounting for character, compassion, and resilience. And I remember the relief in the silence that followed. I felt the first stirrings of a truly new freedom. Rob Easton's objections fell flat, but as the judge reviewed medical affidavits, it was a dangerous codicils proving Sophie's capacity, changing the direction of a life. Accounting, the viral felt like an accusation. Corroborating documents created a structure from which their claims could not placed on Lynn, as if it were court orders something I had failed to be. Uphold the will. I reached for my wallet for misappropriated funds. The $30,000 retirement payment Anna and I had arranged was supposed to be a guardrail. When the judge spoke of fiduciary duty and the sanctity of intent against the scale of the moral acknowledgement of what we had was not just about money. Formal ways. It was about refusing to be dramatic. Reacted like people whose rehearsed narratives had unraveled. Everything else had been eroded. I watched them as the judge read the restitution. I walked to my car beneath the amber lights on the street and felt a complicated mix of emotions that made me think there was no joy in than I usually allowed. Retribution that feeds on schadenfreude with a certain stillness. Accountability that in her parlor dignity has weight. She told me she'd seen enough to repay misused funds better within their laughter was material restitution. I told her about the retirement ledger required other measures and the way bills arrived with new signatures on them. Cameras wanted story I had kept to myself. And people whispered that a moral favors became patterns. Headlines generosity had been repurposed as entitled billionaire's will. Sophie's response ordered to repay millions, precise, and public vindication for humiliated father. She offered a plan. Public reaction variant, she said. For me, The ruling was confirmation that evidence and patience could overcome slander and entitlement. Bank statements, legal insurance records began to unfold, and tuition Weston and Lauren faced civil obligations and appeals. It revealed choices made in my public opinion. There was a tuition investigators for Weston dated and forged endorsements. There was a notarized form that did not provide a probable cause for further withdrawals that traced into accounts I had never touched. The consequences meant ruin for envelopes on my shelf became a dossier of hurts that accountability was being enforced rather than clarified. The discovery that the life insurance policy wrongdoing to enforce $750,000 we coordinated had been diverted with the civil courts to ensure restitution was calculated accurately and that assets could be traced. What remained was painful to see assets listed, the trail of transfers and unauthorized signatures built on entitlement reminded me how fragile social standing can be when tethered to unethical loyalty I had been carrying for decades had been restorative moments and the contents taken. Funds returned to accounts hired an attorney to begin reversing predatory actions. As restitution measures moved forward, she hated publicity. The community's reactions deepened. Noise, they will make noise back from people who had been quietly monitoring the case. People gathering evidence for a careful case. Men who had felt marginalized. Interviews with a few old friends who pursued accountability of the insurance company. A quiet audit of certain accounts. They reached out with like a ghost to help the foundation. It was the laughter at that table. That generosity reframed the private people here in my story must be conversation about dignity. Family is supposed to be shelter, heirs' responsibility became the storm. Weston's legal woes escalated beyond civil restitution. Who learned how fragile dignity can be when and digital trails may measure criminal referrals more likely instead of your heart. Investigators began piecing together a pattern you're watching from and drop your take in the comments as you watch. The reality of potential criminal charges and what their circle really like a storm. I read them all. Business partners will be giving shout-outs to standout comments and videos in the next reputational fallout. So make sure yours counts. Disintegrate in different ways. I've never been proud of my quiet estrangement or public scandal. I was proud of both outcomes, my wife of 30 damage. And the small business we built together until the collapse that took everything. How to honor Sophie responsibly and protect the foundation from notoriety. Not because Sophie it was insisted on careful governance, because I realized how much I had trusted people transparent who were only passing through my life. Strict vetting for leadership. I swallowed the slow poison of exclusion and humiliation, not elevate convincing myself that managing such responsibility required humility. Died the night my son humiliated me at the family dinner. Gatherings evaporated. Dad, don't sit on this table. This is for the rich. Neighbors offered condolences without judgment. It should have been a private organized support for men who had been publicly shamed. A public spectacle. Those gestures suggested the social fabric could repair in small patches. I felt every eye on threads remained severed. Humiliation is not a required practical measure. It is a ledger you moral restoration. Truly, I felt the old numbness settle in, and the judge's gavel follows a funeral and pretends it's resignation. My retirement notice had arrived that week. Satisfied. A $30,000 payout, she said. Installments. Those words mattered more than headlines. Some felt like a fragile paper shield against a storm of contempt. Evidence matters. The waiter set the bill on the table. Is exposed. $5,630. Retribution had come. Materialized like an accusation. Asserted. They all turned to me decline was as if the routine of their cruelty required my compliance. It was a series of small exits. I reached for my wallet with hands that had built and fixed 100 things, and she began to prefer shorter conversations as a child. Yet she remained lucid in ways that mattered most. Without she knew who she loved, what she valued, drained from my face, but my smile was, as always, I am Jesse Hawthorne. It was survival, Sophie's masquerading as civility. I learned how a life can be organized around principle rather than flash. As I rose to leave, after the trial, Sophie's voice cut through the chatter and the clinking of glasses. She insisted on careful stewardship of the estate and on plans for the foundation where most would expect a matriarch to shuffle away from drama. Chose trustees. She walked into the center and programs focused on legal aid, housing, and counseling for men who had been marginalized and humiliated. My family wanted the foundation. The entire dining room leaned in, not an exercise in vanity, but a mechanism for restitution and dignity. She spoke slowly. She also wanted simplicity in death. Water carving her instructions were precise. She told them she had watched their behavior for years. Spectacle. She called the cruelty what it was, integral to her life. That to choice fueled by more fury from those that reshapes you. But Sophie asserted that legacy is not measured by numbers alone, but by character strangers. But Sophie often said, something my children had never done is an empty ledger. The wound. Those words became the foundation's not in a perfunctory way. In the evening, with a gravity that made them uncomfortable. I read letters Anna had written, and was a fracture in the narrative they had rehearsed of old words. The
her
narrative
mind
that had
sharp
reduced
in
me
gentle
to a
ways that
punchline.
signaled clarity.
I felt a strange
She
blend
offered
of
candid
numbness
counsel.
and relief. How to manage
The humiliation
people-seeking
remained,
influence for
but
selfish
Sophie's
reasons.
words cracked
How to
the
set
shell
governance
that
so
kept me
philanthropy
silent.
could not be
People
easily
often
redirected.
ask whether I
and
wanted
how to
revenge
preserve dignity
right then.
for beneficiaries
The truth
who might
is I
be
wanted
fragile.
justice.
Her
But more than
experience
that,
as
I
a
wanted
self-made
recognition.
woman taught me leadership's
simple
hard
acknowledgement
lessons.
that exclusion
As family
and cruelty
fractures
had real
intensified,
faces and real
Sophie
consequences.
asked for boundaries.
As I walked out
She
into the
refused
Tulsa
calls
night,
from people
the
who had
cooling
been
air
abusive
felt like a
and asked
passport
certain
to
names
something
be
unknown.
left out of the funeral
The laughter
program.
followed me.
It was a
distant and
painful
obscene,
renunciation,
but so did
necessary.
Sophie's look. Grief
Steady
and betrayal
almost
can
fierce.
cohabit.
That look
Choosing
would
who
become
you
the
allow near
hinge
your
of
last
everything
days
that
is both
followed.
practical and moral.
I did not know then
Sophie's
that her
clarity
intervention
felt
at
like a
Meridian
gift
Hall
and a
was
rebuke,
only the beginning
a
of a
final
reckoning
curriculum
that would
on the
expose
ethics of
secrets,
care and boundaries.
unravel lies,
The foundation's
and eventually
initial
demand
board
accountability.
included legal experts,
Humiliation had been my
non-profit
steady
leaders,
companion
and
for
trusted
years.
community members.
But that night I learned
Sophie
that
insisted
exposure
on
had
transparency.
power. The world, I would
Independent
later
audits,
understand,
public reporting,
has a hunger
and
for
strict
truth when it's
conflict
given
of
its
interest
spectacle.
policies.
What began as a family's private cruelty was about to become a public narrative.
Those lacking legal
And I,
representation,
the man they had made
and
invisible,
those pushed out of
would be
family
the witness
obligations
and the
because of
unexpected
perceived
beneficiary
poverty.
of a truth
The foundation's
too large to be
mission
contained
statement was
by dinner
concise.
table jokes.
Restore dignity,
That night,
provide
the words
legal
redress
legacy,
and
build
justice
housing
pulsed in my
opportunities
head
for those
like a
in need.
stubborn drum.
Hospice
For
care
so long,
arrived
my
in a
life
quiet
had been
week of
catalogued
rain.
as losses.
Sophie received visits
Business,
from a handful
home,
of people she
Anna,
loved, and the nurse who
Sophie's
had cared for her
intervention
in
planted a
previous
different
years.
ledger.
I sat
One
by her
accounting for
bedside
character,
and watched
compassion,
someone who had lived
and
through
resilience.
triumphs and
In the
trials
silence that
recited
followed,
memories like a
I
litany.
felt the first
She
stirrings
spoke
of a
about
truly
Anna
with
with tenderness
freedom,
and about
not
mistakes
freedom
she
from
had
pain,
made as a
but
parent.
freedom to be
She
heard.
forgave some things
It was
and
and
named
named
other
hope,
wrongs she would
the
not
kind
accept.
capable of
a mixture
changing
of
the
direction
direction
of
of
a
a
boundary
life.
that felt
The
like an
bill
inheritance
felt
in
like an
itself.
accusation.
Her last days were gentle and private.
$5,630.
On the morning
A number
she
placed
died,
on
she took
linen
my
as
hand
if it were
and said,
proof of something I
"You
had
carry
failed to
what
be."
matters."
I reached for
Then
my
she
wallet
closed
and
her
paid.
eyes.
The
There was sorrow
$30,000
and a sense
retirement
of
payment
completion,
Anna and I
a
had
life
arranged
organized
was supposed
around
to be a
principle.
guardrail.
The funeral was exactly as she requested.
It felt flimsy
Small
against
and
the
private,
scale of the
with
evening.
speeches that
Paying
emphasized
the bill was
compassion,
not just about
accountability,
money, and the need
it was
to
about
build
refusing
systems
to
to
be
protect
dramatic,
dignity,
about keeping
those
some
who had been
dignity
excluded
intact
were consciously
even when everything
absent,
else had been
and their
eroded.
absence spoke
After the
loudly.
meal, I walked
After
to
my
my
car
car
beneath
the
the amber
foundation
lights on the
moved from
street.
plan to
The cold had a
implementation.
clarity to it
I
that
convened
made me
the
think
board
more
and we
honestly than I
prioritized
usually
legal aid
allowed.
clinics.
Sophie
Sophie
had
had
watched
watched
the
the
whole
whole
thing
thing
with a
with a
support
certain
hotline
stillness.
for men facing
Later,
family
in her
exclusion
parlor
and
over
financial
tea,
exploitation,
she told me she'd
and
seen
community
enough.
outreach.
You deserve
Sophie's
better
people
than their
worked
laughter,
to transform
she said.
a violent personal
I told her
history
about the
into
retirement
programmatic
payout,
response.
the mortgage,
The goal
and the
was
way
to
bills
prevent
arrived
others
with
from
enduring
signatures
similar
on them.
humiliation.
I told
and
her
to
the
offer
story I had
pathways
kept
for
to myself.
restitution and stability.
How small favors
Sophie's
became
death
patterns.
also
How
shifted
generosity
public
had
focus.
been repurposed
Media
as entitlement.
attention shifted
Sophie's
from scandal
response
to
was
policy.
practical and
the
precise.
foundation had to guard
She
against
didn't offer
opportunism.
catharsis.
We
She
enforced
offered a
rigorous
plan.
governance and
We
published
document,
transparent
she said.
financial reports.
We don't shout.
Sophie would have insisted
The
on
words
accountability
felt like
as
armor.
much as she insisted
We began
on
gathering
compassion.
bank statements,
In private,
insurance
I grieved
records,
and also
canceled
learned
checks,
that survival
and tuition
after
receipts.
betrayal must be tempered
Each
by
page
purpose.
uncovered more than numbers.
Sophie's final curriculum was
revealed
practical.
choices made in my
Make
absence.
structures that
There was a
outlast
tuition
individuals
invoice
and
for
create
Weston
programs
dated
that
after
honor
Anna's
dignity.
funeral.
She had
There was
given
a
me not
notarized
just
form
wealth,
that did not
but a
match my
charge to
handwriting.
convert it into
There were
meaningful
withdrawals
repairs
that traced
Her
into
death left
accounts
me in
I had
sorrow,
never touched.
but it oriented
The
me toward
shoebox
building
of
a
old
legacy
envelopes
that
on
would
my
measure
shelf
people by
became a
character,
dossier of hurts.
not convenience
Every
or
discovery
entitlement.
was painful
The
and
work ahead was
clarifying.
large. The
And
discovery
Sophie's
that the life
absence was a
insurance
deep
policy
ache.
Anna left,
But her last days and the foundation's formation
reminded
had
me
been
that
diverted
justice
with the
extends
hardest
beyond
blow.
courtrooms into
I had
daily
assumed
acts of
trust.
compassion and
I had
governance.
assumed that after
Holding
Anna,
to those
what
values
remained
would be
was
my
mine
way
to
of
manage.
honoring both
Seeing
Sophie
the
and
trail
Anna,
of transfers
and
and
a response to the
unauthorized
humiliation
signatures
and
changed the
exclusion that
humiliation
had once
into
defined
something
my
else.
life.
Outrage.
The downfall of Weston,
The envelope
Lauren,
of family
Amy,
loyalty
and
I had been
George was
carrying
not
for
for
decades
decades
had
so
been
much
split
as inevitable
open and
once
accountability
accountability
moved from rumor
Sophie
to
hired
records.
an attorney to
People
begin
confuse
discreet
spectacle with
inquiries.
consequence.
She
But
insisted on
consequences are
caution
often tedious.
She hated publicity.
Audits,
frozen
if you
accounts,
make noise,
liens,
they will make
and
noise
quiet
back,
criminal
she
referrals.
We
I
moved
watched
like their
people
world
gathering
contract,
evidence for a
not
careful
with
case.
relish. But with a sober
Interviews with a few
comprehension
old
that
friends,
entitlement
a
can
request
fracture
for
records
records
in the
and
insurance
and law
company,
align.
a quiet audit of certain accounts. After
If
the
being
ruling,
treated like a ghost
creditors
as a sound,
noticed liens,
it was the
and
laughter at
lenders
that
began
table.
to scrutinize statements
I say that now
previously
because the
taken on
first thing
trust.
people hear in my story
Weston
must
tried
be
to
the
keep
bone
appearances.
truth.
Social
Family
events
is supposed to be
staged
shelter,
interviews,
but mine became
but the
the
veneer
storm.
cracked as
I'm Jesse
restitution orders
Hawthorne,
and legal
65,
fees mounted.
a man who
when
learned how
assets were
fragile
frozen
dignity
and
can be
houses
listed,
listed,
people you love
the
decide
private
to measure
rituals
you
of
by your
status
bank balance
became public
instead of your
transactions.
Before
Lawrence
we dive
laundry
in,
business,
tell me where
once
you're
touted
wanted
as
from
from
and drop
independence,
your take in the
lost
comments as you
investors
watch.
as partners pulled
Share
back.
your reaction.
Amy and
opinions,
George
and what you
faced
think
social
really happened.
ostracism and
I read
legal
them all.
strain. We'll be giving shout-outs to standout comments and videos in the next civil judgments required make sure yours counts. Criminal investigators sifted my clothes for proof of forgery and conspiracy. I was proud of Weston's case, my wife of 30 years, allegations of fraud because we built together until the collapse that took everything. After her death, faced conspiracy charges felt heavy to endorsement changes and transfers, but because I realized how much I had trusted our civil proofs and added criminal context. 4 years, the personal consequences were sharper than the legal ones, and humiliation. Relationships that had been transactional unraveled when money proved unreliable as social glue. The night my son humiliated me at the family dinner, avoided the family's driveway. Dad, Amy and George's marriage deteriorated under public shame, not the poor like you. Charity boards removed association of private and friends withdrew invitations. It became the couple's reputation, once soft currency, became a liability. George laughed. Social capital evaporated faster than bank balances. Humiliation is not a moment. Public opinion had it is turned. A ledger you keep where there had been mockery of an old man. I felt the old numbness and talk shows parse the kind that follows a funeral and pretends its resignation and family responsibility. My retirement notice had arrived that were uneven. A $30,000 payout faded quietly into obscurity, meant to keep me afloat. Others found limited haven felt like a fragile paper shield against a storm of misdirection. The fallout was raw. The bill on the table. Restitution plus the slow erosion of credibility and future opportunities. The number materialized like an accusation edge of their ruin. They all turned satisfaction, as if the routine of their cruelty required my compliance. Replicated cruelty. I reached for my wallet with hands that had built collateral and fixed 100 things. Workers at Lawrence that failed steadiness my daughter as a child. Neighbors whose quiet stability was disrupted quietly, and children without inherit scandal. The color drained from my face, but my smile was, as always, any impulse to gloat. It was survival masquerading as civility. Desperate email requesting a meeting didn't end there. He asked for mercy as I rose to leave, restructuring familiar voice cut through the chatter and the clinking of glasses. My reply was brief. My mother, whose name meant honor the judgment and accept responsibility. Where most would expect a matriarch to shuffle away from drama. But she also no forgiveness that felt undeserved. May I have a moment, forgiveness please? Must often be earned through accountability. The disbelief in the air cannot be manufactured by a late plea. The entire dining proceedings moved slowly, an orchestra of judgment waiting charges for the conductor's baton. Investigations continued slowly, and each word a deliberate drop of water carving through stone. Eventually faced trial. She had watched their behavior for years. Less she called the cruelty what it was. When guilty findings came, they were recorded in legal language with real penalties. To be betrayed publicly is to be handed your own obituary in front of strangers. Lauren took a plea in exchange for something my children had never done. Cooperation clarified elements of the financial trail. She said she was disappointed. Meanwhile, not in a perfunctory way, confronted a diminishing gravity that made them uncomfortable. Were filed amid recrimination was a fracture in the narratives they had rehearsed for years. Fines and the narrative that had reduced me to a punchline. Their life, once felt a strange blend of numbness and legal deadlines and fraying relationships. But Sophie's children faced the social consequences of their parents' choices in schoolyards whether I wanted revenge, a reputational erosion. The truth is I wanted justice. But more than that, I wanted recognition who had been watching. A simple acknowledgement that exclusion by family ambition had real faces and real consequences. Their stories formed a mosaic of humiliation that extended beyond my house to something unknown. They reminded me the case of broader implications, distant and obscene. It wasn't only one family's cruelty, but structural patterns that normalize exploiting elders become the hinge of as restitution payments began. I did not know then that her intervention at Meridian Hall was only the beginning of a reckoning that would expose secrets. The foundation began programs to eventually financially accountability or socially humiliation had been my steady companion for years to help others seek accountability. That exposure had attention to building institutions I would later understand entitlement from destroying relationships when it's given a spectacle. The collapse of the family's private cruelty was about to become a public narrative. Consequence, used wisely, they had made can restore some measure of justice and prevent recurrence. Beneficiary of a truth their lives narrow was painful by dinner table jokes. That night, the words legacy and justice will obscure harm in my head like a stubborn drum. Social consequences for Weston and my life had been catalogued as losses. My hope was that it would prompt reform rather than merely spectacle. Intervention planted a different verdict. Much of the spectacle had dimmed, character, compassion, we had promised resilience bright. In the silence that followed, foundation I felt the first stirrings of a truly new freedom. Governance. Not freedom from pain, but freedom. And what I have learned is the best revenge is not undoing another person, but becoming what they said the direction of life. The foundation was our answer to humiliation and to the obligations Sophie outlined in her last days.
Number placed on limit
We started
as if
small,
it were proof
a
of
legal
something
aid
I had
clinic
failed
offering
to be.
pro bono representation
I reached
to
for
my
my
men and
wallet
fathers
and paid
facing financial
the
exploitation.
$30,000 retirement
housing
payment
program
and
I had
temporary
arranged was
refuge
supposed to be a
and a
guardrail,
counseling initiative
paid
for
in
those suffering the
installments.
emotional
It
fallout
felt
of
flimsy
family exclusion.
against the scale
Our
of the
initial
evening.
grants emphasized
Paying the bill
repair,
was not just about
helping
money.
men reclaim
It was
stolen
about
pensions,
refusing to be
securing
dramatic,
temporary housing,
about keeping some
and
dignity
providing
intact
trauma-informed
even when
counseling
everything
for those
else
whose
had been
dignity
eroded.
had been eroded.
After the meal,
The objective
I walked
was
to
to
my
turn
car
private
beneath
ledgers
the
of
amber
lights
lights
on
on
the
the
street
street
into public
The cold
resources
had a
that
clarity
restored
to it
dignity
that made me think more
governance
honestly
mattered
than I usually allowed.
Sophie insisted on
Sophie had
transparent
watched
boards,
the whole thing with a
independent
certain
audits,
stillness,
and rotating
Later,
leadership
in her
roles
parlor
to
over
avoid
tea,
concentrated
she told
power.
me she'd seen
We
enough.
hired experienced
You deserve
nonprofit
better than
managers,
their laughter,
legal
she said.
directors,
I
and
told her
community
about the
liaisons.
retirement payout,
We
the
set
mortgage,
measurable outcomes,
and the way bills arrived
cases
with new
taken,
signatures on them.
restitution recovered.
I told her the story
housing
I had
units
kept to myself,
occupied,
and counseling
how small
sessions
favors
completed.
became patterns.
The foundation's
How generous
generosity
annual
had been
report was
repurposed as
candid.
entitlement, wins to
Sophie's
celebrate,
response was
failures to learn
practical
from,
and precise.
and a financial
She
statement
didn't
open to
offer
public
catharsis.
scrutiny. She
The
offered a
foundation
plan.
quickly gained
document,
traction.
she said.
Local lawyers
We don't
volunteered
shout.
time. Community
The words
groups
felt
offered
like
space,
armor,
and former
we began
clients
gathering
became
bank
advocates.
statements.
Insurance
Stories
records
accumulated,
canceled
a man in
checks,
his
and
70s
tuition
coerced
receipts.
into signing documents
Each page
now had
uncovered
property
more
rights
than numbers.
restored. It
Another
revealed
father
choices
reclaimed
made
pension
in my
funds,
absence.
siphoned into a
There was a
child's
tuition
private
education
invoice for Weston.
Those
David
victories
after
were
Anna's
small in
funeral.
headlines, but
there was a
immense in the
notarized
lives they
form
quietly
that did
repaired.
not match my
We
handwriting.
launched prevention.
There were withdrawals
Workshops
for
that
families
traced
about
into
legal
legal
rights
rights.
I had never
Seminars
touched.
for elder
The
care
shoebox of
professionals
old envelopes
and
on my
outreach
shelf
to financial
became a
institutions
dossier of
to
hurts.
create safeguards
Every
against
discovery
forged
was
endorsements.
painful and clarifying.
Education became a
The
tool for
discovery that
dignity.
the life insurance
When
policy
people know the
left,
rules and how to protect themselves,
$750,000
opportunists
had been
lose
diverted
much of
was
their
the
advantage.
hardest blow.
The outreach
I had
emphasized
assumed
trust.
practical steps.
I had assumed that after
Where to
Anna,
store policies,
what remained was
how to
mine to
verify
manage.
endorsements,
Seeing
and
the
who to
trail
call
of
when
transfers
suspicion
and
arises.
unauthorized signatures
Public
changed
reception
the
shifted
humiliation
toward
into
respect
something
for
else.
the foundation's
Outrage.
work. Media
envelope of
profiles
family
moved
loyalty
from
I had
scandal
been
to
carrying
policy.
for decades had
The
been
foundation's
slit open and the
transparent
contents
reporting
taken,
and Sophie's
Sophie
moral
hired
clarity
an
helped
attorney to
sustain
begin
trust.
discreet
That
inquiries.
trust was fragile.
She insisted
We
on
guarded it
caution.
with audits,
She hated
ethical
publicity
reviews,
and a
If you
commitment
make
to serve the
noise,
most
they will
vulnerable
make
rather
noise
than
back,
chase headlines.
she warned.
More
We
than
moved like
programs,
people
the
gathering evidence
foundation
for a
built
careful
communities.
community. Men who had been
Interviews with
isolated
isolated
friends,
peers,
a request for records at the
volunteers
insurance
became
company,
friends,
a quiet audit of
clinicians and
certain
lawyers
accounts.
formed a support network. The headquarters gallery displayed photos of beneficiaries and brief notes about their regained dignity. Each
being
photograph
treated like a
represented
ghost
a
as a
story
sound
that
that
moved
moved
the
the
laughter
needle
from
from table.
humiliation to hope.
I say that now
we celebrated
because the
small
first thing people
wins
hear
with
in my
quiet
story must be the
ceremonies that
bone deep
honored
truth.
resilience rather than
Family is
spectacle.
supposed to be shelter,
The foundation
but mine
also
became the storm.
fostered policy
I'm Jesse
conversations.
Hawthorne, 65,
We partnered with
a man
advocacy
who learned
groups
how
to push
fragile
for clearer
dignity
laws
can be
around
when people you
endorsements
love
and
decide
decide
to
to
measure
measure
you by your bank balance
and to
instead of
demand
your heart.
stronger penalties
Before
for
we dive in,
financial abuse.
tell me where you're watching
Testimony
from and
criminal
drop your
cases
take and
helped
comments as
influence
you
local
watch.
ordinances
Share
and
your
inspired
reaction,
legislative
opinions,
proposals.
and what you think really
Seeing
happened.
law move
I read
alongside
them all.
support services
We'll be
suggested
giving
that
shout-outs
sustained
to
standout
standout
comments
comments
both
and
videos in the next
upload.
repair.
So make sure
Sophie's
yours counts.
legacy taught
I've
leadership
never been
lessons.
proud of my clothes
She
or my
insisted
bank
money
balance.
without governance
I
is
was
an
proud of
accelerant
Anna,
for the corrupt.
my wife of 30
so
years,
we prioritized
and
the
small
training,
business we
ethical
built together
stipends for
until the
staff,
collapse that
and
took
a
everything.
culture of accountability.
After her death,
Leadership
the quiet
meant
of our house
refusing
felt
shortcuts
heavier,
and saying no
not because
to
it was
appealing
empty,
proposals that
but because
risked
I
diluting
realized
the
how
mission.
much I had trusted
That
people who
discipline
were only
sustained the
passing through my
foundation
life
through early growing
4
pains
years,
and set
I
a
swallowed the
tone-centering
slow
dignity
poison
in
of
every
exclusion
decision.
and humiliation.
Personally, I found
Convincing
a
measure
measure
of
of
peace
love would outlast
running
greed.
the foundation
That
required
illusion
humility.
died the night my son
Administrative
humiliated
discipline
me at the
and a
family
steady
dinner.
moral center.
He said to me,
It also required
Dad,
meeting
don't sit
people
on this
where they
table.
were.
This is for the
rather
rich,
than positioning
not the poor
myself
like you.
as the arbiter of redemption.
It should have been a
when I
private
looked at
wound.
impact numbers,
Instead,
cases
it became
won,
a
dollars
public
recovered,
spectacle.
shelters funded.
Lauren laughed.
They read like
Amy
small
and George
reconciliations.
laughed.
I
Within
felt
a year,
every
the
eye on
foundation
me.
had helped 700 men
Humiliation is
reclaim
not a
legal
moment.
rights. Secured
It is a
restitution
ledger you
amounts
keep in your
exceeding $3
chest.
million.
I felt the
and
old
donated
numbness
$1
settle
million
in.
$1,000 to shelters and
follows a funeral and
pretends it's resignation
services.
My retirement
These
notice had
numbers
arrived that
translated
week
into housing,
a $30,000
counseling,
payout,
legal
in
wins,
installments,
and community
meant to keep
trust.
me afloat.
The final,
that sum
unexpected
felt like a
reward
fragile
was
paper
paper
shield
shield
against a
resources
storm of
repurposed.
contempt. Where
The waiter
Weston
set
and
the bill
Lauren
on
had
the
turned
table.
Anna's money into private luxury,
$5,630.
restitution and
The
foundation
number
were
converted those
materialized like an
transfers into public
accusation.
services
They
supporting
all turned to
hundreds.
me,
The
as if the
theft
routine
became,
of their
in a
cruelty
strange
required
accounting of
my
justice,
compliance,
a source of
I reached
repair.
for my wallet
It
with
wasn't
hands that had
revenge.
built and
It
fixed
was
a hundred
reclamation
things
in service
the
of
hands
others.
that had steadied
As
my
I
daughter
stand
as
at
a
the head of a
child.
board meeting
I
and
hear
paid the
trustees
bill
argue wisely
quietly
about where to allocate
without
resources.
protest.
I think
The
of
color
Sophie's
drained
part
from
of my
words.
face, but my
Use what
smile
you have
was,
to make
as
people
always,
whole.
polite. The
It was
foundation
survival
is our
masquerading
answer to
as
humiliation
civility.
and exclusion.
But the story didn't
It is
end
proof
there.
that a ledger
As
can
I
be
rose to
rewritten,
leave,
an old
where once
familiar
there was
voice
loss,
cut through
there
the
can be
chatter and the
restoration.
clinking of glasses.
The work continues,
Sophie Reyes,
and so
my
must
mother,
we,
whose
because
name meant
dignity,
weight in
once
that room,
restored,
where
is the
most would
true
expect a
measure of
matriarch
success.
to shuffle away
Before
from
you
drama.
judge me,
She
ask
walked into the
yourself,
center and said,
how far would you go
"May
to
I have
reclaim
a
your
moment,
dignity
please?"
after betrayal cuts you
I
open?
could hear the
If
disbelief
vengeance
in
was
the
the
air.
only language
My
left,
family still.
would you still chase
the entire
justice
dining room
or
leaned
forgiveness?
in. An orchestra
trust
of
turns to
judgment
ashes
waiting
and
for the
love
conductor's
becomes a
baton.
weapon.
She
What
spoke
truly
slowly.
redeems a man?
Each word
His
is a deliberate
regrets
drop
or his
of water
revenge?
carving through
Tell me
stone.
what you think.
She told them
Was
she
I
had
wrong
watched their
or just
behavior for
human?
years.
Drop your thoughts
She called
below.
the cruelty
And if
what it
stories
was.
like mine make you
Betrayal.
question loyalty,
To be betrayed
justice,
by
and
blood
the price
is a
of
pain
redemption
that reshapes you.
Subscribe for more
To be
stories
betrayed
that challenge the
publicly is
heart
to be
and
handed
haunt
your
your
own
conscience.
obituary in front of strangers. But Sophie did something my children had never done. She named the wound. She said she was disappointed, not in a perfunctory way, but with a gravity that made them uncomfortable. That single intervention was a fracture in the narrative they had rehearsed for years, the narrative that had reduced me to a punchline. I felt a strange blend of numbness and relief. The humiliation remained, but Sophie's words cracked the shell that had kept me silent. People often ask whether I wanted revenge right then. The truth is I wanted justice, but more than that I wanted recognition. A simple acknowledgement that exclusion and cruelty had real faces and real consequences. As I walked out into the Tulsa night, the cooling air felt like a passport to something unknown. The laughter followed me, distant and obscene, but so did Sophie's look, steady, almost fierce. That look would become the hinge of everything that followed. I did not know then that her intervention at Meridian Hall was only the beginning of a reckoning that would expose secrets, unravel lies, and eventually demand accountability. Humiliation had been my steady companion for years, but that night I learned that exposure had power. The world, I would later understand, has a hunger for truth when it's given a spectacle. What began as a family's private cruelty was about to become a public narrative, and I, the man they had made invisible, would be the witness and the unexpected beneficiary of a truth too large to be contained by dinner-table jokes. That night, the words legacy and justice pulsed in my head like a stubborn drum. For so long, my life had been catalogued as losses. Business, home, Anna. Sophie's intervention planted a different ledger, one accounting for character, compassion, and resilience. In the silence that followed, I felt the first stirrings of a truly new freedom. Not freedom from pain, but freedom to be heard. It was a dangerous hope, the kind capable of changing the direction of a life. The bill felt like an accusation. $5,630, a number placed on linen as if it were proof of something I had failed to be. I reached for my wallet and paid. The $30,000 retirement payment Anna and I had arranged was supposed to be a guardrail, paid in installments. It felt flimsy against the scale of the evening. Paying the bill was not just about money. It was about refusing to be dramatic, about keeping some dignity intact even when everything else had been eroded. After the meal, I walked to my car beneath the amber lights on the street. The cold had a clarity to it that made me think more honestly than I usually allowed. Sophie had watched the whole thing with a certain stillness. Later, in her parlor over tea, she told me she'd seen enough. "You deserve better than their laughter," she said. I told her about the retirement payout, the mortgage, and the way bills arrived with new signatures on them. I told her the story I had kept to myself, how small favors became patterns, how generosity had been repurposed as entitlement. Sophie's response was practical and precise. She didn't offer catharsis. She offered a plan. "We document," she said. "We don't shout." The words felt like armor. We began gathering bank statements, insurance records, canceled checks, and tuition receipts. Each page uncovered more than numbers. It revealed choices made in my absence. There was a tuition invoice for Weston dated after Anna's funeral. There was a notarized form that did not match my handwriting. There were withdrawals that traced into accounts I had never touched. The shoebox of old envelopes on my shelf became a dossier of hurts. Every discovery was painful and clarifying. The discovery that the life insurance policy Anna left, $750,000, had been diverted was the hardest blow. I had assumed trust. I had assumed that after Anna, what remained was mine to manage. Seeing the trail of transfers and unauthorized signatures changed the humiliation into something else. Outrage. The envelope of family loyalty I had been carrying for decades had been slit open and the contents taken. Sophie hired an attorney to begin discreet inquiries. She insisted on caution. She hated publicity. If you make noise, they will make noise back, she warned. We moved like people gathering evidence for a careful case. Interviews with a few old friends, a request for records at the insurance company, a quiet audit of certain accounts.